The second part of Module 10 is about fungi, and I decided to, as I believe I mentioned before, to separate this part of the chapter out from the earlier part of the chapter, again, just because there's a lot of information here, and I thought it would be good just to focus on fungi by themselves for this next test. So let's start by looking at the general characteristics of a fungus. All of them are composed of eukaryotic cells, which should be obvious to you because you'll recall when we talked about classification that the kingdom fungi is in the domain of eukarya, which means that they are going to have eukaryotic cells. Again, meaning that they have membrane-bound organelles. Most organisms in kingdom fungi are multicellular. Now, not all of them are. In fact, one of the most common fungi that we use a lot in our everyday lives is yeast, and it tends to be more unicellular, but most fungi that you find are going to be multicellular. All of them are heterotrophs, which means that they do not make their own food. Now, when you see a mushroom growing out in your yard, you may think it looks like a plant, but in reality it's not, because it is not capable of making its own food like trees and grass and squash plants are capable of making their own food. Fungi are not capable of that, and they have to get food from another source. Most fungi are saprophytic, and what that means is that they are going to get their nutrition from dead organisms. Some of them are parasitic, but not all of them. All fungi are going to make spores to reproduce, and what is also true is that fungi are very good at reproducing, and they have methods to produce both asexually and sexually. And as we'll find when we get a little bit further into the module, fungi are classified by the way in which they sexually reproduce. When they do make spores to reproduce, a lot of times those spores are produced in a specialized structure specific to that particular kind of fungi, and we'll be learning about that as we learn about the different classifications of fungi as well. A fungus is composed mostly of what's called a mycelium. It is responsible for the extracellular digestion that is what enables the fungus to get its food. Now, extracellular digestion may sound a little strange. Extra means outside of. So what that means is that while we've seen organisms that will use phagocytosis to engulf a piece of food, they'll take it in and then they'll enclose it in a food vacuole, and then they'll put in enzymes to digest that food. With a fungus, the digestion is all on the outside. So what they do is they secrete a chemical onto the substance on which they are living. It digests the food on the outside, and then they absorb the nutrients. That would be sort of like, this may sound a little gross, but it's the best way I know how to explain it. You have a plate of spaghetti in front of you, and in place of eating it and then digesting it on the inside, what you would do is you would like barf up all of your stomach acid onto the plate, and you'd kind of stir it around until it digested, and then you would drink all the stuff that's on your plate. Yeah, I know, that's really gross. But in reality, that's kind of what a fungus does. Extracellular digestion means they're going to excrete this chemical. The chemical does the digesting, and then they take the nutrients in after it's been digested outside of their cells. There are some funguses that will make people sick. And normally, if you get sick from a fungus, it is specifically because of this chemical that they are secreting to take care of the digestion. Now, the mycelium, the main part of the fungus, is composed of hyphae. And a hypha is basically just a filament of cells. You can think of it almost like a hair. It's a long string, a long strand of cells. And there are two different types of hyphae that make up a fungus. They're either septate or they're non-septate. And what that refers to is whether or not these hyphae have cell walls between their cells. Now, in non-septate hyphae, it actually kind of looks like just a big multinucleated cell, because they all just kind of fuse together, and so you're going to see all these different nuclei, and they're not separated by cell walls. Now, in septate hyphae, the reason the way I can remember that is because septate almost sounds like the word separate or separate. And so if I have separate cells, that means there's going to be cell walls between them. But these cells are not like any cells that we have seen previously, because in your hyphae, let's say that this one is just one cell thick, and so here's a cell wall, and then here's a cell wall, and here's our nucleus. And what you'll see is that these cell walls actually have little openings in them, and the cytoplasm in the cell is able to flow from one cell to the next. And so although the cells technically are separate, you can actually see that although they're mostly separate, the cytoplasm is still going to be able to go from one cell to the next. So even though they're called septate and they appear to be separate, they're still not completely separate because that cytoplasm can mix. Some types of fungus have septate hyphae, other types have non-septate hyphae. So you just need to know that there's both kinds. We're not going to concern ourselves so much as to which kind of fungus has which kind, but just know that both kinds are out there. So those are our general characteristics of fungi, and as we move on later in the chapter, we're then going to start studying the specific phyla of fungi and get to know some of the different types and how they reproduce.